You want to own a fish farm, cages floating in a fjord, salmon stacking up by the ton, a business that runs itself in the ocean, a paycheck that shows up whether you leave the house or not. Global salmon farming pulls in more than $20 billion a year. Here's the problem. None of that is actually yours. A fish farm isn't a farm. It's a lease with fins. Fish farming means a lot of different things. Oysters and mussels grown on ropes, catfish ponds dug into Mississippi clay, tilapia tanks stacked in a warehouse. None of those are what people picture when they imagine owning a fish farm. What they picture is salmon, big steel and plastic rings, floating offshore, holding tens of thousands of fish in open ocean water. That's the version this is about. Open net pen, Atlantic salmon farming, the same industry that dominates supermarket shelves from Oslo to Ohio. It's also, by a wide margin, the most heavily regulated form of fish farming, because the pens sit in public water, not private land you can simply buy. You don't purchase a fish farm the way you'd purchase a ranch. You apply for, bid on, or inherit a government license to occupy that water, and the fish are almost incidental to what you're actually acquiring. What you're buying is a number. How many tons of living fish you're legally allowed to hold in the ocean at any one time. That number is called your biomass allowance, and everything else in this business gets built around that single figure. The whole modern version of it traces back to two Norwegian brothers, Ove and Sivert Grundtvedt, who in 1970 anchored the first floating sea cages off the island of Hitra. Wooden frames, styrofoam floats, nets borrowed from herring fishing. Every pen on every fjord today answers to the same kind of paperwork those two brothers never had to deal with, and that paperwork is about to get expensive. So what does it actually cost to get in? Two completely separate price tags, and almost everyone underestimates the first one. Start with the license itself. In Norway, the world's largest salmon farming nation, the government auctions off biomass allowance a few thousand tons at a time. In one recent sale, 30 companies paid a combined 5.9 billion Norwegian kroner, something like $670 million, just for the right to grow more fish before a single smolt hit the water. The average price worked out to roughly $25,000 per ton of allowance. By a more recent auction, that average had climbed past $32,000 a ton. One company, Lovundlax, 20 employees, total, paid the equivalent of over $40 million just to add 1,900 tons of capacity. Worth pausing on that. 20 employees, $40 million, and not one fish grown yet. Then comes the physical build-out. Steel and high-density plastic net pens, mooring systems anchored to the seabed, feed barges, generators, workboats, a hatchery or a smolt supply contract, because a farmed salmon spends its first year growing on land before it ever touches salt water. A single hatchery cycle for one mid-sized site can run well into 7 figures, locked in over a year before harvest. None of it refundable if the fish don't make it. In 2016, one operator paid more than $70 million to acquire 9 existing farm sites across 4 locations in Washington state. That's where the second price tag hides. Existing net pens come with existing wear, 30-year-old mooring lines, gear that's been sitting in salt water for decades, maintenance records nobody has fully audited. Regulators can also revalue your allowance mid-license, or freeze your growth outright, depending on conditions you don't control. You don't just inherit a license. You inherit whatever the last owner didn't get around to fixing. Now for the part that actually pays you. Layer 1 is the obvious one. You grow salmon, you harvest it, you sell it at market price. That price moves constantly, but a kilo of salmon typically sells at first sale, somewhere around $6 to $9 a kilo. Multiply that by tens of thousands of tons, and you understand why this industry turns over billions of dollars a year worldwide. But raw harvest is the least profitable layer, and the smartest operators know it. Layer 2 is processing. A whole fish sold on ice earns you a certain margin. The same fish, filleted, portioned, vacuum-packed under your own brand name, sold as a premium product line, earns considerably more per kilo without adding a single extra fish to the water. The world's largest salmon farmer built an entire consumer products division just to capture that difference, turning the exact same harvest into smoked slices, sushi-grade cuts, and frozen ready meals sold under its own name. That one company pulled in more than 5.5 billion euros in revenue in a single recent year, off 500,000 tons of fish, roughly what a mid-sized country's entire tourism industry brings in, from fish that started as eggs in a tank. Layer 3 is feed. Feed is normally the single biggest cost in this business, which sounds like bad news, until you own the mill that makes it. The same company that farms the fish also runs its own feed operation, selling feed not just to itself, but to competitors too. And in one recent year, that feed division alone turned a profit on more than 500,000 tons of feed. You've turned your biggest expense into a second business. Layer 4 is the one almost nobody counts, and it's the strangest one. The license itself appreciates. Remember that biomass allowance you paid for? Prices per ton at auction went from around $25,000 to over $32,000 in just a few years. Sit with that for a second. The paperwork is worth more than the product it represents. A number on a government spreadsheet, now worth more than the fish swimming in your pens. That's the strangest sentence in this entire industry, and it's completely true. Here's what eats that revenue alive. Feed alone typically swallows more than half of what it costs to grow a kilo of salmon. Soy, fish meal, fish oil, vitamins, shipped in by the tanker load to cages sitting miles from the nearest port. There's a number for how efficient that feed is. The feed conversion ratio, how many kilos of feed it takes to grow 1 kilo of fish. Salmon are efficient, close to 1-to-1, but efficient still means paying, in full, for every kilo before you sell an ounce. Then there's the parasite that keeps operators up at night, sea lice. Treating for lice means running fish through mechanical delousing systems, medicating entire cages at once, or stocking cages with cleaner fish, wrasse and lumpfish that eat lice off salmon skin, and it costs real money repeated every few weeks for the entire cycle. Now, here's the number that looks safe, and isn't. A farm can report an annual mortality rate that sounds perfectly normal for the industry, somewhere in the high teens, as a percentage, and investors nod because that's the expected cost of doing business. But that average hides the number that actually matters: a single bad week. One salmon farming giant disclosed that a jellyfish bloom and a gill infection in 2 separate quarters of the same year cost it 2 million euros in one quarter and 22 million euros from incidents, not the ongoing average at all. The yearly mortality rate told you nothing about either of those weeks, and underneath all of it sits the real fragile point. Since 2017, Norway has run what's called the traffic light system. The coastline is split into zones, and every zone gets scored every year on how much sea lice from farmed salmon are estimated to be killing wild salmon nearby. If your zone gets a red light, regulators cut every farm's allowed growth in that zone, not just the operator whose lice count was high. You can run the cleanest site on the coast and still lose your growth allowance because 3 farms down the water didn't control their lice. Your economics aren't just tied to your own fish, they're tied to your neighbor's fish too. Which brings us to what happens when the inherited trap goes wrong. In 2016, Cook Aquaculture bought 9 Atlantic salmon farms across Washington state for more than $70 million. The pens it bought were already 30 years old. On August 19, 2017, one of those net pens near Cypress Island simply came apart in the water. State investigators later found the cause. The nets hadn't been properly cleaned in years. Mussels, barnacles, and seaweed had built up on the netting until it weighed more than 100 metric tons, over 6 times what the clean net itself weighed. 100 tons of mussels on a net built to hold 16. That's not a rounding error, that's a physics problem. The mooring system, designed for a 16-ton net, was never built to hold 6 times that load in strong tidal currents. It gave way. Cook first blamed the collapse on the tides from that week's solar eclipse. Investigators checked the currents. They were well within the range the same pen had handled for years. The eclipse had nothing to do with it. Cook's own early reports put the number of fish that escaped at around 160,000. State investigators concluded the real number was somewhere between 243,000 and 263,000 Atlantic salmon, loose in Puget Sound. Local tribes were authorized to catch as many as possible. One tribe alone recovered over 40,000 fish, nearly 200,000 pounds of salmon, selling them back to Cook for $30 a head. Cook later offered $42 a fish if the tribe would drop its push for a ban. The tribe said no. Some of the escaped fish were still turning up in rivers 8 months later. The financial reckoning came in layers. First, a $332,000 state fine for negligent maintenance and for understating how many fish had actually gotten out. Then, a federal lawsuit settled for $2.75 million, funding water quality restoration across Puget Sound. Then the real cost: Washington's legislature banned the farming of non-native Atlantic salmon in state waters entirely. Cook's Atlantic salmon business in the state was wound down by regulation, not by choice. A single, unwashed net, left too long between cleanings, ended an entire company's presence in an entire American state. The infrastructure hadn't failed all at once. It had been failing slowly, invisibly, for months before anyone could see it from the surface. So who actually comes out ahead in this business? Not the small operator paying today's auction price. The real winners are the companies that own every rung of the ladder at once. The world's largest Atlantic salmon farmer harvested more than 500,000 tons of fish in a single recent year, bringing in over €5.5 billion in revenue, with more than 12,000 employees across 7 countries, and it owns its own feed mills, its own hatcheries, its own processing plants, and its own consumer brands on grocery shelves. When feed prices fall, it profits twice. Once as a farmer paying less for feed, once as a feed producer selling that same feed to every smaller competitor still fighting for scraps. The second winner is less obvious: the government itself. Every license auction hands the state billions of kroner up front, regardless of whether the buyer ever turns a profit on the fish. One recent Norwegian auction alone raised more than 5 billion kroner for licenses covering just over 17,000 tons. Money the state collects the moment the gavel falls, years before a single fish is harvested. It's the tidiest business model in the whole industry, the only one that never has to touch a fish. Much of that money doesn't stay with the national government at all. It flows to coastal counties and towns through something called the Aquaculture Fund, which means the municipality hosting your pens gets paid whether your farm makes money or not. And the quietest winners of all are the companies that got there first. Some of today's biggest salmon farmers hold licenses issued decades ago for a fixed government fee, back before auctions existed at all. Capacity that would cost tens of millions of dollars at today's prices, sitting on their books at a fraction of that for as long as they keep the fish alive. So what does a year actually look like if you're the one holding the license? In a good year, prices are high, mortality stays low, feed costs ease, and your fish convert feed to weight efficiently. A well-run mid-size operation can clear a margin of a couple euros on every kilo of salmon it harvests, which spread across a few thousand tons is real money, several $1 million in a single season. In a bad year, almost none of that holds. An algae bloom or a jellyfish swarm kills a meaningful share of one cage in a single weekend, wiping out months of feed costs with nothing to sell at the end of it. A neighboring farm's lice count spikes, your zone goes red, and your growth gets frozen no matter how well you ran your own site. Global harvest volumes hit a record, prices soften under the extra supply, and the same fish that would have sold for $9 a kilo sells for $6 instead. None of those 3 things are under your control. The honest truth is, the spreadsheet can tell you what a good year pays and what a bad year costs, but it can't tell you which one you're getting, because the deciding factor in this business isn't management skill, it's biology, weather, and what's happening in a stranger's cage 3 miles down the coast. So no, you don't own a fish farm. You own a number the government can shrink, a mooring system older than you think, and a slice of an industry where your biggest competitor might also be your landlord, your feed supplier, and the reason prices moved against you this quarter. The fantasy was a fjord full of salmon that pays you while you sleep. The reality is a license, a biology experiment in open water, and a government watching your lice count more closely than your bank account. You wanted to own the ocean's cattle ranch. What you actually bought was a bet on the weather.